The crimson sun cast long shadows across the dusty plains of Wyoming Territory as Abigail Prescott stood on the weathered porch of her isolated homestead, watching another day die with no one to share the sunset. It was 1878, and at 26 years old, she had grown accustomed to the painful silence that followed her like a faithful shadow. The harsh winter wind whipped at her skirts as she clutched her shawl tighter around her shoulders. 3 years had passed since the influenza had taken her parents, leaving her to manage their struggling ranch alone. The neighboring homesteaders had gradually moved on after several seasons of drought, and those who remained kept their distance, whispering that the Prescott land was cursed. "Another day ends," she murmured to herself, her voice nearly lost in the vast emptiness surrounding her. She had spoken aloud merely to hear a human sound, a habit developed from too many months without proper conversation. Inside her modest cabin, the fire crackled in the stone hearth, providing the only warmth in her solitary world. Abigail moved to her mother's rocking chair and picked up her mending, working by the light of a single oil lamp. Her fingers, calloused from years of ranch work, moved deftly through the fabric as she repaired a tear in her only good dress. Sleep came fitfully that night, as it often did. Dreams of laughter and conversation haunted her phantom companions that vanished with the dawn. Morning brought the same routine, feeding the few remaining livestock, tending her small garden, and maintaining endless repairs on a homestead designed for a family, not a lone woman. As noon approached, Abigail spotted a dust cloud on the horizon. Visitors were rare enough to cause concern. She reached for her father's rifle, keeping it ready as she watched the approaching rider. The stranger rode a chestnut stallion that had clearly seen many miles. His clothes were trail-worn but well-kept, and despite the dust coating his denim and leather, there was something dignified in his bearing. When he removed his hat to wipe his brow, she noticed his hair was the color of wheat fields in late summer. "Hello, the house." He called out, stopping a respectful distance from her porch. "I mean no intrusion, madam. Name's Lucas Alder. My horse could use some water and I'd be grateful for the same." Abigail hesitated, rifle still in hand. "There's a water trough by the barn," she replied, her voice rough from disuse. "You can fill your canteen there." The man, Lucas, nodded his thanks and guided his horse toward the barn. Abigail watched warily as he dismounted with the fluid grace of someone who'd spent most of his life in the saddle. "I'm heading to Silver Creek," he explained, not approaching the house but speaking from where he stood. "Got word they're hiring experienced hands at the Blackwater mine." "Blackwater shut down last spring," Abigail informed him, surprised to hear herself volunteering information. "There was a cave-in. 3 men died." Lucas frowned, removing his hat again and holding it against his chest. "I'm sorry to hear that. Seems my information's outdated." He looked around the property, taking in the faded paint and sagging fence posts. "You running this place alone, madam?" "That's not your concern," she replied sharply, then immediately regretted her tone. It had been so long since she'd engaged in conversation that she'd forgotten the rhythm of it. "No offense meant," he said easily. "Just seems like a lot of work for one person." Abigail lowered the rifle slightly. "It is, but it's mine to do." She paused, then added, "Silver Creek's still a going concern, even without the mine. They're building a railway spur. Might be work there." Lucas smiled, and something in Abigail's chest tightened unexpectedly. It had been years since anyone had smiled at her with such genuine warmth. "I appreciate the information, Miss Prescott. Abigail Prescott, Miss Prescott. Might I trouble you for directions to Silver Creek? My map shows it, but not the best route from here." Abigail hesitated, then set the rifle aside. "You can't make it before nightfall. There's a creek crossing that's dangerous in the dark." The words surprised her even as she spoke them. "There's a lean-to behind the barn where you can sleep. I'll point you to Silver Creek in the morning." Lucas's eyes widened slightly, but he nodded his thanks. "I'd be grateful. I can earn my keep any repairs need doing." Before she could answer, a distant rumble of thunder caught their attention. Dark clouds were gathering on the western horizon, promising a substantial storm. "Storm's coming," Abigail said unnecessarily. "Best get your horse in the barn, there's an empty stall." As Lucas led his horse to shelter, Abigail returned to the house, her heart racing. She hadn't invited a stranger to stay on her property since her parents died. The solitude that had been her constant companion now felt suddenly fragile. The storm hit with unexpected ferocity, bringing not just rain but hail that pounded the roof like angry fists. Abigail found herself setting 2 plates on her small table and adding extra potatoes to the stew she'd been simmering. When a knock came at her door, she smoothed her apron nervously before opening it. Lucas stood there, hat in hand, rain dripping from his duster. "Your barn roof's starting to leak," he reported. "I've moved my horse to a dry stall, but you might want to check on your animals." "Thank you," she said, stepping back. "Come in while I get my coat." He entered cautiously, removing his duster and hanging it on a peg by the door. Abigail noticed he'd taken the time to clean the mud from his boots, a small courtesy that spoke of good upbringing. They hurried through the downpour to the barn, where they found water streaming through a section of the roof over the hay storage. Together they moved feed bags and equipment to drier areas. "This needs proper repair," Lucas observed, pointing to the rotted beams. "The next heavy snow could bring it down entirely." Abigail nodded, knowing he was right but unwilling to admit the task had been beyond her capabilities. "I've been meaning to fix it." "I could help," he offered, his tone matter-of-fact rather than pitying. "I've built my share of barns." She wanted to refuse, to prove she needed no assistance, but practicality won out. "I'd appreciate that." They returned to the house, both soaked despite their brief time in the rain. Abigail lent Lucas one of her father's old shirts while his dried by the fire. The sight of him in her father's clothing stirred complicated emotions she couldn't name. Over dinner, Lucas spoke of his travels across the territories, of cattle drives from Texas and mining camps in Colorado. He'd been a ranch hand, a deputy sheriff, and briefly a schoolteacher in a frontier settlement. "What brings you so far north?" Abigail asked, surprised by her own curiosity. Lucas's expression grew thoughtful. "I've been wandering too long, thought it might be time to put down roots somewhere." "And you chose Wyoming?" she asked with skepticism. "Winters here would freeze the horns off a bull," he laughed, a rich sound that filled the small cabin. "I don't mind the cold when there's a warm hearth waiting." "But you have no hearth," she pointed out. "You're a drifter." "For now," he agreed easily. "But not forever." The storm continued through the night and into the next day, making travel impossible. Lucas spent the morning repairing the loose shutters Abigail had been struggling with for months. By afternoon, the rain had slowed enough for them to assess the barn roof damage. "We can salvage most of those shingles," Lucas said, pointing to a pile of cedar shakes Abigail's father had cut years before. "But we'll need to replace that center beam. You have any suitable timber?" "There's pine in the North Grove," she replied. "My father was saving it for expanding the house." They worked side by side for the remainder of the day, cutting and hauling timber. Abigail found herself talking more than she had in years, sharing stories of her childhood on the homestead, of her parents' dreams for the place. "They wanted to build a proper ranch," she explained as they took a brief rest. "Not just subsistence farming, but cattle, horses maybe. It's good land for it," Lucas observed. "Needs more hands than one, though." "I know," she admitted quietly. "I've been trying to keep it going until." She trailed off, unsure how to finish. Until what? Until someone came along to help. Until she gave up. Until the right opportunity presents itself, Lucas suggested gently. That evening, as they ate rabbit stew by lamplight, Lucas told her about losing his family to a border raid in Texas when he was 19. "Been on my own since then," he said, "moving whenever memories got too heavy." "Does it work?" Abigail asked. "The moving," he shook his head. "Memories have a way of traveling with you. I've learned that running from ghosts just tires a person out." She nodded, understanding completely. Sometimes I think this place is haunted by all the hopes my parents had for it. Hopes aren't ghosts, Miss Prescott. They're seeds waiting for the right season. The storm finally broke on the third day. Together they patched the barn roof enough to keep out the weather until a proper repair could be made. When Lucas saddled his horse to leave, Abigail felt a hollow sensation in her chest she hadn't anticipated. "Silver Creek's about a day's ride northeast," she told him, pointing toward the distant mountains. "Follow the creek until you reach the trading post, then take the wagon road east." Lucas nodded, securing his saddlebags. "I'm obliged for your hospitality, Miss Prescott." "You worked for it," she replied, trying to keep her voice steady. He mounted his horse and settled his hat firmly on his head. "I'd like to return if that would be agreeable. There's more work needs doing on that roof." Abigail hesitated, torn between hope and caution. "You needn't feel obligated." "It's not obligation," he said simply. "I'd like to come back." She nodded, not trusting her voice. As he rode away, she remained on the porch until his figure disappeared into the distance, leaving her alone once more with the whisper of the wind. True to his word, Lucas returned 10 days later with supplies from Silver Creek, nails, tools, and even coffee and sugar he'd purchased with his earnings from temporary work at the livery stable. "Town's growing," he reported as he helped unload the supplies. "Railway crews hiring. I signed on for a month's work. Good wages." "That's fortunate," Abigail said, trying to hide her disappointment that he'd be leaving again so soon. "They're only working weekdays," he added. "I thought I might ride out here Saturdays, help with those repairs, if that's agreeable to you." And so began a pattern that lasted through the summer of 1878. Lucas would arrive Saturday morning, work alongside Abigail on the most pressing repairs, and depart Sunday evening. Together they rebuilt the barn roof, repaired fences, and even constructed an irrigation channel from the creek to her garden. With each visit, the awkwardness between them diminished. Abigail found herself looking forward to their shared meals, to conversations that stretched late into the evening. She began baking bread on Fridays in anticipation of his arrival and taking more care with her appearance. "You've brought this place back to life," Lucas observed one evening in late August as they sat on the porch watching fireflies dance over the meadow. "We've done it together," she corrected him. "I couldn't have managed alone." "You were managing," he said with admiration, "just at a slower pace." She smiled at that. "Perhaps, but it's been good not to be alone." The admission cost her something in pride but felt right nonetheless. Lucas nodded, his expression thoughtful. "The railway work ends next month. They're offering permanent positions for some of the men." Abigail felt her chest tighten. "Will you stay on with them?" "I've been considering my options," he said carefully. "Silver Creek's a good town, growing fast. But it's a long ride from here." "Yes," she agreed, uncertain what else to say. "Abigail," he said, using her given name for the first time, "I've come to care for you, more than I expected, more than might be proper to admit." Her heart raced as she met his gaze. "I've come to care for you too, Lucas. I don't want to presume," he continued, "but I've been thinking about what you told me about your parents' dreams for this land." "It's a good dream," she said softly. "Too big for one person, though." "But not for two," he suggested, his voice low and earnest. "Not for a partnership." The word hung between them, full of possibility. Abigail took a deep breath. "Are you proposing a business arrangement, Mr. Alder?" A smile touched his lips. "I'm proposing we could build something here together, if you're amenable, as partners," she pressed, needing clarity. "For starters," he said. "With the possibility of more in time, if your feelings might eventually match mine." Abigail felt a warmth spreading through her chest. "And what exactly are your feelings, Lucas?" "That I've found what I've been searching for since I lost my family," he answered simply. "A place that feels like home, a person who makes me want to stop wandering." She reached out tentatively and placed her hand over his. "I thought I was cursed to be alone here forever, that no one would ever want to share this life." Lucas turned his hand to clasp hers. "You'll never be alone again, Abigail, not if I have any say in the matter." The first snow of winter came early that year, dusting the repaired roof of the Prescott homestead with white. Inside, Abigail added another log to the fire as Lucas finished their evening meal preparations. 3 months had passed since his proposal, and though they had agreed to take their time in developing their relationship, he had moved into the lean-to behind the barn, coming to the house each day to share meals and work. "Stew's ready," he announced, placing the heavy iron pot on the table. "It smells wonderful," she replied, bringing over the fresh bread she'd baked that morning. They ate in comfortable silence for a few minutes before Lucas spoke. "I rode into Silver Creek yesterday while you were visiting the Morgans, spoke to Reverend Daniels." Abigail looked up, her pulse quickening. "Oh," he said, he'd be willing to ride out here if the weather holds, perform a service if we wanted. She set down her spoon carefully. "What kind of service did you have in mind?" Lucas met her gaze steadily. "The kind that would make us more than partners in business, Abigail. The kind that would let me move out of that cold lean-to and into this house proper." "Are you proposing marriage, Lucas Alder?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. "I am," he confirmed, reaching into his pocket and producing a simple gold band. "I've saved from my railway work. It's not fancy, but it's honest, like what I feel for you." Abigail stared at the ring, emotions welling in her throat. "We've known each other less than 6 months. And in that time, I've learned all I need to know," he said confidently. "You're strong, determined kind. You face each day with courage even when you're afraid. I admire you, Abigail, and I love you." Tears blurred her vision as she reached for his hand. "I thought I'd lost my chance at happiness when my parents died, that I'd spend my life alone on this land until it eventually claimed me too." "Is that a yes?" he asked, hope evident in his voice. "It's a yes," she confirmed. "I love you too, Lucas." "I think I have since you fixed my shutters without being asked." He laughed and slipped the ring onto her finger. "I knew I was courting you when I repaired that fence in July heat without complaint." "That was impressive," she agreed with a smile. "Almost as impressive as when you stood up to Mr. Hollister at the general store when he tried to overcharge me for flour." Lucas leaned across the table and gently kissed her, a promise of the life they would build together. They were married 2 weeks later in a simple ceremony attended by the few neighbors within riding distance. Reverend Daniels blessed their union, and for the first time in years, the Prescott homestead was filled with laughter and music as the small gathering celebrated. That night, as snow fell gently outside their window, Abigail and Lucas began their life as husband and wife, the solitude that had once defined her existence giving way to the warmth of shared dreams. Spring brought new life to the ranch. With Lucas's steady work and Abigail's careful management, they purchased their first small herd of cattle. The irrigation system they'd built the previous summer allowed them to expand the garden, producing enough vegetables to sell in Silver Creek's growing market. "We should give this place a proper name," Lucas suggested one evening as they watched the sunset from their porch, the same porch where Abigail had once stood alone. "What did you have in mind?" she asked, leaning against his shoulder. "How about Promise Ranch?" he suggested. "Since this place represents the promise we made to each other and to your parents' memory." Abigail smiled, placing her hand over his. "Promise Ranch, I like that." As summer approached, Abigail discovered she was carrying their first child. The news filled them both with joy and renewed purpose. Lucas worked tirelessly to complete the addition to the house her father had planned years before, creating a nursery adjacent to their bedroom. "Do you ever regret it?" Abigail asked one night as they lay together, his hand resting protectively over her growing belly. "Giving up your wandering life to settle here with me?" Lucas propped himself up on one elbow to look at her properly. "Not for a single moment," he said with conviction. "My wandering was just searching, Abigail, searching for exactly what I found here with you." By the time their daughter was born on a crisp October morning in 1879, Promise Ranch had transformed. New fences enclosed expanded pastures, the barn stood sturdy and weather-tight, and the house gleamed with fresh paint. What had once been a struggling homestead was becoming the thriving ranch Abigail's parents had envisioned. They named the baby Emma Grace, after both their mothers. She had Lucas's wheat gold hair and Abigail's determined spirit, evident even in her earliest days. "She's perfect," Lucas whispered, cradling his daughter with awe, "just like her mother." "Hardly perfect," Abigail laughed softly, "but completely loved." The years that followed brought both challenges and triumphs. Drought tested their resolve one summer, and a harsh winter claimed some of their livestock. But together, they faced each obstacle, their partnership strengthening with every shared burden. By 1883, Promise Ranch had become one of the most successful operations in the county. Their cattle herd had grown, and Lucas's skill with horses had led to a profitable sideline in breeding and training. Abigail managed the household and kept the accounts with precision, while also tending to Emma and the twin boys who had joined their family the previous year. Neighbors who had once whispered about the cursed Prescott place now sought their advice on irrigation techniques and breeding stock. The solitude that had once defined Abigail's existence was replaced by a home filled with children's laughter and regular visits from friends and fellow ranchers. On the 5th anniversary of their marriage, Lucas surprised Abigail with a small gathering of their closest friends and neighbors. After dinner, as their guests enjoyed apple pie and coffee, he stood and raised his glass. "5 years ago, I was a wanderer with no place to call home," he began, his gaze finding Abigail's across the room. "I happened upon this ranch during a storm and found shelter not just from the rain, but from the loneliness I'd carried for years." Abigail felt tears welling as he continued. "I found a woman of extraordinary courage who had faced her own storms without breaking, who had maintained this land through sheer determination and grit." He smiled at her, his eyes shining. "Abigail Prescott Alder gave me more than a home. She gave me a family, a purpose, and a love I never thought possible." He raised his glass higher. "To my wife, the heart of Promise Ranch, thank you for believing we could build this life together." Later that night, after their guests had departed and the children were asleep, Abigail and Lucas stood on the porch where they had first begun to envision their shared future. "Did you ever imagine this?" she asked, gesturing to the prosperous ranch spread before them. "When you rode up that day, seeking only water for your horse," Lucas slipped his arm around her waist, drawing her close. "I knew this place was special from the moment I saw it," he said, "but it wasn't the land that called to me, Abigail, it was you." "I was so afraid then," she admitted. "Afraid of hoping, of trusting, afraid of wanting something I thought I couldn't have." "And now?" he asked, turning to face her. She smiled, placing her hand against his cheek. "Now I know that some dreams are worth fighting for, that some promises are kept." "Always," he affirmed, kissing her gently. "Do you remember what I told you that day on the porch when I asked to build a life with you? You said I'd never be alone again," she recalled, the words still precious to her after all these years. "It's still true," Lucas said softly. "And it always will be." As the stars emerged above Promise Ranch, Abigail leaned into her husband's embrace, grateful for the storm that had brought him to her door, for the courage they'd both found to trust in love, and for the life they continued to build together, a life that had transformed her solitude into belonging, her isolation into connection, her curse into a blessing beyond measure. The land that had once felt like her prison had become the foundation of her greatest joy. And the woman who had once believed herself destined for eternal solitude now stood surrounded by the family she and Lucas had created, proof that even the longest shadows eventually give way to light.